So today we have, I feel needs no introduction, we have Mary Harrington, who is a contributing editor at Unheard. She's written for The Times, The Spectator, and innumerable other publications, and is also the author of Feminism Against Progress, which is the subject of our conversation today. And we also have Nina Power, who is the senior editor of Compact magazine and author of What Do Men Want? Masculinity and Its Discontents, which was published in 2022, so last year. So I want us to cover as much of your book as possible. So let's get stuck in straight away with your ideas around the Industrial Revolution and what that meant for women and the sort of trajectory of feminism into what now you call the cyborg theocracy, which we can get to later. But just to set the scene, sort of what is the genesis of this book, and what is the sort of historical basis for your ideas about the biopolitical age?
So I started thinking about the book when I had a baby. I started thinking about progress when I stopped believing in it, which was actually I was thinking it's very strange to be back at the RSA, because back at the point where the peak of my belief in progress, I was here a lot, but that all fell apart a very long time ago in the kind of around 2008, the year of the big crash. And by the time I'd surfaced from that kind of personal catastrophe, which I won't bore you with here because it's boring, but anyway, it was just a massive kind of multi-dimensional black pill that left me just feeling like I had to reassemble my worldview from the ground up, including everything which I thought I knew about what the purpose of life was, what progress meant, or even whether progress was a thing. And I came out the other side of that 7 or so years older, with a psychotherapy qualification, no longer living in London, and married. Which was not where I was before. Prior to that, I was kind of house sharing and living a very sort of postmodern, kind of hyper liquid, hyper modern, avant-gardist life as a sort of art maven in SE24, and co-founding web startups and curating interactive art events
and going by the name Sebastian.
And going by Sebastian, yeah, that's in the book as well. So there's a very very kind of mental, a very whiplash sort of story arc. So that was 7 years. It felt like a long time at the time, but it wasn't really, I suppose. And by the time I surfaced from all of that with something like a functioning worldview, I realised that I didn't really believe in progress anymore. And I thought, well, is it possible to be a feminist if you don't believe in progress? And I realised that's actually quite a difficult question to answer. Because any time you say, well, I don't believe in progress, they're like, but would you want to go back to being your husband's property and not being allowed to vote? Yeah, there you go, progress. And I was like, well, yes, but, and the but is kind of the content of the book. Like, it's complicated. The answer, being an English lit graduate, my view is always that the answer is yes and also no. And that's there you go. That's the book. So that was kind of my rabbit hole. But I mean, what really concretized it for me was having a baby and realizing that so much of what I believed feminism was structurally incapable of seeing what being a mother was. That the two seemed mutually exclusive in a way which didn't really make sense. In the sense that, I mean, being a mother is a very fundamental part of being a woman. Right, for a great many women, the majority of women, I think. And so it didn't really make sense to me that there should be this enormous mother-shaped blind spot in so much of feminist theory, where being a mother and motherhood and mothering and the obligations and that interdependence between a mother and a baby are treated as a problem to be solved. I thought how am I supposed to make sense of this? And I thought, well, how is it? Because it's not as though, I sort of got into it a bit more, as you do. There I'm pushing my baby around the streets in small town England and thinking about these things. Because it's not like your brain stops when you have a baby. It's not like you suddenly become a kind of it goes on working. So there I'm trundling my baby around the streets and thinking, well, here I am being a stay-at-home mum, and actually it's quite a nice life, and I always thought this was a sort of terrible oppression, but it's not. And actually I found myself in this position where I thought all these other mothers who've had babies around the same time as me are going back to work now, and they're hating it. They're really ambivalent about it, and actually I'm at the point where I could go back to work, and my husband said, well, do you want to go back to work? And I said, actually, I was shit at every job I did before. Just absolutely rubbish at all of them. I get sacked within 2 years, absolutely without fail. And there's nothing that I want to do that enough to want to be away from my baby 12 hours a day. And the fact that we're in a position economically where I actually have that choice, that's not me being oppressed by the patriarchy, that's a privilege. And that really turned everything on its head for me.
And you give this beautiful description, firstly, of the way firstly, this is not a beautiful description of the way that women have become disembedded through industrialization and through the digital age.
Yes,
but actually you give this really beautiful and I thought very moving description of the process of being pregnant, the neurological, biological and actually genetic implications of being pregnant, and how you experience yourself as being sort of embodied as a woman, and that is a sort of it's in such conflict with the way that society has come to understand women's place.
Absolutely, and I
thought that was very beautiful.
When I sort of going down the rabbit hole of thinking, well, how did we get to the point where feminist theorists have tried to make the case for motherhood, and they've tried to make the case for care, and they're constantly banging on about care, and they're constantly banging on about interdependence, and somehow that's not the version of feminism that ever makes it to the top. Why does this keep happening? And being a nerd, I ended up kind of, went all the way down the rabbit hole, and I thought, well, when did we start doing feminism? And I mean, academics differ on this, but broadly speaking, feminism comes into being with the industrial era, and I realised that this is because feminism needs to come into being with the industrial era, because that was the point at which women's lives changed for the majority of women, so radically that in fact at that point women needed to speak up and say, well, actually, there are issues that we need to sort out here. And I suppose that was my kind of aha moment, where I realised that there was possibly a way of reconciling being a feminist with not believing in progress. I thought, well, we just have to we just have to stop believing in the idea that that this is evidence of things getting better, and read it instead through an historical lens and think, no, actually what we're looking at here is not necessarily some things getting better, it's things changing in response to transformations in material conditions. And the central one, where the women's movement is concerned, the central transformation that women responded to was the departure of work from the home. And Dorothy Sayers actually writes beautifully about this. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but there's a wonderful essay called Are Women Human?, where she says something to the effect that the Industrial Revolution took away from women most of the industries that had previously been women's, the textile making, food production, processing raw materials into goods for the family, creating clothes. Most of those bled away from the home and became something which happened in factories. And then she says, well, are women, should we blame women for wanting to find something else useful to do with themselves now that they're not doing that anymore? It's a fair question. And this is fundamentally what the women's movement is doing.
And in the context of the internet age, you talk about the sort of idea of people imagining themselves as a being of pure thought. And that's almost a sort of like ultimate disembedding. You use the term liquefying a lot in the book. How would you explain that sort of concept of cyborg theocracy in relation to that trajectory?
I was getting to that. I mean, I think the first time I ever set out the book thesis in anything like its kind of in its whole shape was at a conference a couple of years ago, when I realised that the argument I wanted to make was that the sexual revolution ended feminism. It wasn't the beginning of feminism, it was the end of feminism. And that feminism began with the Industrial Revolution in that response to the transformation of women's lives under industrial conditions as work left the home. Whether it was by demanding to enter the market on the same terms as men, or whether by trying to make a case for domesticity without all of those productive activities which had hitherto been women's work. And so those are the feminism of care and the feminism of freedom are the sort of the two poles of that argument. But the case that I wanted to make, which is the kind of a core of my thesis in Feminism Against Progress, is that argument ended in the 1960s with the sexual revolution. And it ended with the arrival with another tech transition. And it's my view that we no longer live in the industrial era. We haven't for 50 years. We're half a century into the transhumanist era, and that began with the contraceptive pill. And it was concretized, particularly in the domain of of feminism, with the legalization of abortion. Now, just to say, I don't want to relitigate the legality of abortion here, but its legality is indisputable. And I think wherever you stand on fetal person, and I dare say there are observant Christians here, and there are people who are more ambivalent, and I'm sure there's a range of views here. It's difficult to think of a stronger way of making the statement that freedom is more important than care, than to say my freedom is so important that it's worth preserving, even if that comes at the expense of a potential life. And at that point, the feminism of freedom and the feminism of care, which had previously existed in this very rich dialogue for something like 200 years, over the course from Mary Wollstonecraft really up to the 1960s. And if you read 19th century feminism, it's an incredibly vibrant, rich dialogue between women who want to make the case for our embodied interdependent life in the context of families and relationships, and women who are making the case that no, we should. It's the defence of women's interests is to enter public life on the same terms as men and to be able to compete on the same terms as men. Like Harriet Taylor Mill makes that case very passionately, but that debate was resolved conclusively in favour of the feminism of freedom with the legalisation of abortion. And at that point, once those two issues become identified, that say, to be a feminist is to advocate for my freedom even from the constraints of my own body, even at the expense of a dependent life. At that point, we entered into we arrived in a new era, which calls it, it's gone on calling itself feminism, but I prefer to see it as a kind of biolibertarianism, which is to say a libertarianism of the body, which declares that the progress means emancipating ourselves from every constraint of our bodies, and the rest. This is kind of the potted thesis for part one, and parts 2 and 3 are really part 2, which is I think what Emma's very keen to get stuck into, is really trying to dig into why that transformation, which presents itself as feminist, is anything but. That it is in fact is profoundly anti-women, if in the sense of women as embodied beings, embodied humans who are irreducibly dimorphic, as all embodied humans are, and part 3 is just what I think we might do about that.
So before we get stuck into the devouring mother and the meat Lego Gnosticism and the second half of
horrible
the book,
coinages.
Nina, I wanted to get your thoughts on Mary's account of the history of feminism and this idea of post-industrial society disembedding women from sort of the normal sort of social, natural, organic relationships that are, I think, I would say is a true representation of who women are. And obviously you've written also about men in this context. So I just wondered if you could give us a few comments on sort of that historical arc that Mary has sketched.
Yeah, I think it's really complicated when we're talking about which thing comes first, whether it's kind of innovations in the economy or technology and then the kind of political and social realm, right? So, if we're thinking about enclosures and, we were England was great at this, like before everyone else, and what it means to kind of privatise land. And if you read Sylvia Federici's book on Caliban and the Witch, and she talks about the way in which women's knowledge was enclosed, right, like all of these forms of midwifery and medicine, and these were made into kind of big pharma, which is obviously, we end up with the contraceptive pill, but it's also about how, like, mathematizing and making all of this knowledge kind of amenable in a particular commercial way. So I think, when we're talking about freedom as a kind of ideology, and I agree that it's sort of presented as a sort of individual choice, this is the great ideology of our age, but from another point of view, it's not freedom at all. To have to sell your labour power on the market is a form of exploitation. That's what that's what it is. And so to not have a child because you have to work is not freedom at all, right? Like it's not any kind of real freedom. So I think the economy and politics is very, very clever at turning something which is presented as a demand or like an ideal image of the world, like let's say flexibility, like what would it be like to both have a child and to do some work that you enjoyed, right? And then it gives you one bit of that really badly, you know, like you can have a child and be poor, you can have a job but it's sort of on our terms, you know, there is no, like you can work part-time but you're paid less. And you know, in the middle of the 20th century, you have the kind of mass entry of women into the workforce in the West after World War II. Obviously, you've had working class women for hundreds of years. But work becomes this kind of absolutely like, I don't know, meme, to use this kind of internet language, you know. And what that means is that you can not pay the family wage, you can pay men and women both less, right? And then say, well, you both have to earn a living, right? So again, and this is all branded as like emancipation and so on. And I think
Eleanor Rathbone was onto this, wasn't she? In 1917, she was making the case for paying women to stay home, so that the family wage would not be diluted.
Right, but it was. So so you know, and this is like branded as flexibility and freedom and emancipation, and it's I think the feminist sort of kernel, like, and it's obviously different at different points, but. You know, and the second wave also has a great dimension of the defence of the natural, which I think is forgotten. Like that bit of the second wave didn't win, you know.
No, it didn't.
No, it did not.
No, so the social care, you know, nature, even the goddess stuff, you know, that didn't win. We had the kind of one that was most amenable to a certain kind of liberal, you know, individualistic capitalism, right, of course, which ends up as a kind of consumerism and then consumerism of the body, which, just to go back to the enclosures point, it's like enclosures are now of everything, right, of every aspect of our body, you know.
And I think what's distinctive about the turn to the cyborg era is that we stop enclosing things outside in the world or in the domain of knowledge, and we turn that into the human body.
Exactly. So like everything becomes like a part or a commodity or something to be sold.
You also talk about the Adam Smith's ring fencing of moral sentiments, and how actually this sort of like abstract understanding of freedom, you say it sort of liquefies all social relations. It liquefies all of that sort of organic social organisation, basically. Do you think?
I mean, Smith was reasonably confident, you know, and which as he might well have been, based on how things were organised in his time, that we could ring fence the social and treat the market society as a. I think it was optimistic, and it hasn't really worked out like that. But that was what he believed, that moral sentiment and, you know, the domain of moral sentiment could be kept distinct, and that in fact markets were an adjunct to a life lived well. And he saw, to the best of my understanding, there may be more knowledgeable Adam Smith nerds here than me, but to the best of my knowledge, he didn't think that markets should be the sole thing regulating society. I think it was really the utilitarians the following century who introduced that idea and made the full transition to the idea that markets should just regulate everything. And I mean that only really and even then that only really percolates into the field of human emotions and the human body with the turn to the cyborg era in the 20th century. So it's been a long journey, but you know, I think it was Adam Smith was, with hindsight, very optimistic, but perhaps it was a reasonable stance from where he was sitting.
I think, well, even more disturbingly, I mean, the theory of moral sentiments, in a way, like, you know, he says there's a kind of fellow feeling and a sort of sympathy that we have for one another, right, by virtue of our, you know, being human almost, and this is a kind of foundation for all forms of like relationality, right, including economic ones. And I think that the really dark thing about the kind of enclosure of emotion and particularly sympathy, and this goes to the devouring mother, is like now you have the kind of total weaponization of emotion as a form of control, right? And if you think about what it means to be in a workplace and have to adhere to various sort of HR and DI and all this stuff, where it's like you can't make jokes, you can't, like, you know, you can't be rude about anyone, you know, all of the things that make you like have a nice time at work.
You see, this is why I get fired every 2 years.
No, this is why I can't have a proper job either. But I mean, not that my job isn't a proper job. Oh God, I'm going to get fired. But it's like, you know, with this kind of over emotive, like world in which it's like, you know, everyone's offended, everyone's upset, you know, everyone's complaining about like microaggressions or whatever. And it's not, do you know what I mean? Like the kind of tyranny of that, you know, and we could call it a form of feminization, right? Like a kind of like the toxic feminine, right? It's not to say this is like women's fault, but like the feminization of labour has sort of brought about these new forms of surveillance and control in the form of these emotional, like, tyranny.
You've handed me the perfect segue.
Okay.
I was just about to ask you about, so this, you write about the way in which young children are cared for as a result of this disembedding. So you have a whole generation of children who are raised by a sort of third-party carer that is this kind of machine mother, and that gives them a certain understanding of what care is and what it means to be looked after and what comfort and love feels like. And that seems, as my understanding from your book, tends towards an understanding of care that leans in the direction, I'd say, of being slightly soft towards totalitarianism or authoritarianism, because it's a kind of creates a sort of reliance on others, and this Jonathan Haidt talking or Jordan Peterson talking about safetyism and this sort of offence culture that Nina mentioned. So can you explain that?
Please unpack. Okay.
In terms of sort of what is the impact of that in relation to your idea of the devouring mother? Because I am fascinated by this idea of, because you talk about the Disney film Tangled.
Ah, yes.
And it sets up a whole sort of framework, I think, for understanding not just what's going on with youth activist movements and women's issues, but it seems to me to be something that's sort of lying at the very foundations of a lot of what's going wrong on a national level. But we can get to that afterwards.
So I'm going to choose my words carefully here, because it's very, 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 very difficult to talk about the dark side of being a mum without upsetting somebody, or saying something that my daughter will later regret, or just any number. There are so many ways that saying anything along these lines can go wrong. So with that footnoting, I'm now going to stand on all the landmines. So I found the devouring. I just found the devouring mother a really arresting phrase, and I think I stumbled across it in a passing reference by Jordan Peterson, who's not a figure I follow particularly closely. Well, I mean, he's a significant kind of cultural force these days. But I found it a really arresting phrase, and I thought, where does that come from? And that speaks to me. What is this? And so I sort of went rummaging a bit. And it turned that this is a Jungian archetype that crops up in the Jungian psychoanalytic literature, and the idea is that this is a mode of being. It's really the dark side of being a mother. And as an archetype, this is the mother who cares for her children in a way that consumes their potential. She nourishes herself by consuming her children's potential. The mother who won't let her children grow up, the mother who and I thought, well, what is it about this which is so eloquent? Because I mean, it's not as though I see an epidemic of women who are keeping their children so close that they never leave home. That's not really what. Where do I locate the devouring mother? And I realised that where I locate the devouring mother is in fact within institutions. If there's a place where I'd locate the devouring mother as actually an exceptionally powerful force in the culture as it's developed, in the one we live in today, it's in the institutional caregiving settings that have emerged to replace care under the order of the feminism of freedom. Now, just to footnote again here, I have used institutional childcare. My daughter has had a great time in a number of preschool and childminding settings. Not full time, but she's got a lot out of that. And the vast majority of people, mostly women, who work in those settings are wonderful, dedicated, committed people, and most of those settings are great. However, I have some questions about that as the primary paradigm for how we care for very small children. And the reason I started thinking about this, and where this connects back to to safetyism, particularly, and to a much wider set of cultural phenomena which people have begun to notice today. And Jordan Peterson connects the devouring mother to safetyism, but doesn't really, at least I'm not aware of anywhere. He's sort of unpacked that a bit. And I thought, well, why would safetyism be the devouring mother? And I thought, well, when I think about the difference between being a stay-at-home mum with say a 3-year-old, as I have been, and the difference between that and sending your 3-year-old into an institutional setting, one of the really characteristic differences between those two contexts is how much risk you can afford to let your child take. Now, if I'm sort of pottering around the streets of small-town England with my child, I can let her walk along a 4-foot-high wall because I'm right there. And I can keep an eye on her. I'm only averagely neurotic as a mother, and this is fine. But there's absolutely no way that a childminder would allow my daughter to do that. And if they did, I'd probably go bananas. So and then I was thinking, well, what happened? Okay, so now you think about the sort of qualitative difference and how that just gets normalised, and then you scale that up to, what is it? Something like the 75% of children who experience some form of institutional childcare, and you think that's a lot of children who are taking a great many fewer risks. And then I'm thinking, well, if you scale that up again, and you think that actually a great many of these children are beginning in institutional childcare, a lot of them full time, from possibly before the age of 1. How many of them have grown up just assuming that sort of because it's not just about the safetyism, it's also about the child-centeredness of it. That's the other characteristic difference between being a stay-at-home mum and, well, at least the sort of Gen X, benignly neglectful stay-at-home mum that I was anyway. And putting your child into a preschool setting. Like if they're in a childminding type setting, everything is ordered around them all the time. There are activities, there are fun things to do. It's not as though the kids would just be plonked in the corner while your childminder does the dishes. But actually, chances are, if you're at home, a certain amount of time will be spent just doing that. If you're looking after your own kids, because there's just stuff that needs to be done. Right? And most stay-at-home mums don't just mum. They'll be involved in other things as well. They'll cart their children around doing whatever else it is that they're involved in. So it's just qualitatively a totally different setting to be growing up in. One of them is one of them is anxious, profoundly anxious about the possibility of you coming to physical harm, and everything is ordered around your interests and enjoyment. And the other setting, your interests are taken into account, but they're not the only thing that's going on. And you probably get to take more risks, and you probably get ignored more. And then I'm thinking, well, if you okay, now fast forward 20 years, and what happens when those two children go to university? And then you think, well, how much, to what extent does this actually explain this sort of the unhinged tone that's crept into campus politics, particularly in, where issues around identity are concerned, where issues around safety are concerned. I remember watching this really arresting video from about 5 years ago, I think it was Evergreen, where a student absolutely beside herself in tears is saying, this is supposed to be a home, and you've made it unsafe. And I'm thinking, well, this is a very odd idea of home that you have. And then I thought, my God, she probably grew up, her idea of home is probably a nursery. Or, she's somehow indelibly baked in to her earliest understanding of what home means and what safety means, is something like that sort of institutional risk aversion combined with child-centeredness. And so, I don't know, when I talk about the devouring mother, I don't mean a literal devouring mother, I mean something metaphorical.
Cyborg mother.
Yeah, I mean exactly, as a depersonalised, institutionalised, procedural cyborg mother. Whose body is comprised of a set of processes we've developed for ourselves in order to offset a more direct set of interdependent human relations, and which nobody really wants to look at directly, or at least nobody wants to look at the potential downsides or the potential pitfalls of organising our intimate and our caring lives like this, because there's just too much riding on that cognitive dissonance. There's just
how would you say, Nina, this is playing out in an institutional setting? Because this has profound implications.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I think when we're talking about institutions, we have to think of them as incredibly invasive, headless acephalic, to use a pretentious word, bureaucracies. And we saw people's response during COVID, and the fact that like everything is being kind of completely enumerated and numbered. And I think one of the things that the institution doesn't allow people to do is develop character. So you end up with people who are like very, very, like you say, anxious, very upset, used to a kind of protective world. They haven't taken risks necessarily. And again, this is not like about blaming individuals in a certain way. Like I think we shouldn't get too hung up on this kind of like pathologization of generations and so on, as tempting as it is. But let's say, the institutionalized person is anxious, will always look up to complain. Like it's always like, who can I complain to? Like something's not right, I don't feel safe,
Which again is characteristic of the preschool as opposed to the home setting.
Exactly, right.
An irreducible conflict is something that you take to one of the helpers.
Right. So disagreement, for example, oh my God, this makes me feel bad. Someone disagrees with me, or I don't know how to deal with an argument. I don't know how to deal with like negative feeling. Right, if you haven't had an expansive range of like difficult emotions, right, you just can't cope with anything. There's a problem. Like safetyism itself is incredibly dangerous. Like that's the truth of it. Like if you live a life that is protected and without suffering and without real grief, the fact that like things like grief are pathologized in a medical sense now, like grief is in the DSM-5. The fact that actually the sort of real experiences of life, like loss, like heartbreak, like all of these things are sort of seen as pathological. They're not seen as like central features of a normal human life, and one in which people mature as well. Like what is it to mature? It's actually to have a whole series of like terrible experiences generally, right? I mean, like that's what being an adult is, and
it's not the only thing.
Well, no, but like but it's important. Like and I'm not saying suffering is bad. Like suffering is good. I'm not saying we should like massively multiply suffering, but it's like the alternative. What I'm trying to say is that the alternative generates more suffering, and I think the bureaucratization and the institutionalization of individuals creates people who are very, very, very scared, and they are scared to oppose things like terrible rules. Like people don't want to break the rules, even though the rules are like stupid, like the lockdown rules or whatever, because people are very, very afraid because they've been institutionalized. And I think it's interesting to compare like millennials to Zoomers, right? The younger generation, like the Zoomers, I think, know how to play the game. I'm generalizing horribly, but these are young people like in their early 20s, as opposed to people who are now reaching their 40s, right? But they've seen the system doesn't work, right? I think the millennials were promised a sort of status like, oh, if you just play the game in this system, you can get a job, you can, but what the system ends up meaning is like cancelling other people, because then there's like less competition and stuff. Like it's really mercenary and really, really unpleasant. Whereas I think the Zoomers are like, maybe there'll be this kind of absolute break from all of these like institutional forms, including the internet, because like the devouring mother is like the internet, like the surveillance system. The fact that like people are looking at what you tweet and they're going to report you, and like why the hell are we on this thing? It's terrible. It's like literally like a Stasi we've signed up for, and we're all on it. And I think that sort of anxiety and that fear has to break at a certain point. And the internet is also fucking boring. Like if you're a millennial, because like you did school during lockdown on the internet, boring. Your parents are on the internet, boring. Like I think there's going to be like a rebellion against these forms of this acephalic, bureaucratizing surveillance systems. I mean, I don't know if you see hope in this, like against the cyborg, against the devouring cyborg mother, whether this is coming. Just say yes.
The answer's always yes and also no.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough.
I mean, the vast majority of Zoomers are still depressingly woke. I mean, that's not in dispute, I'm afraid. However, I am broadly optimistic, because I think, increasingly, whether they're woke or not, people have figured out that actually you shouldn't put everything on the internet, and that's the beginning. That's the beginning of salvation. Is the aesthetics? It is first an aesthetic, and then a politics of occlusion, and then from a politics of occlusion, a return to discipline and self-restraint. I mean, I'm sorry, I just went very fast there. I can do that again more slowly, but maybe you see what I mean.
Discipline and self-restraint. Okay, how are we going to do this?
By not talking about it in public. I'll tell you about it later.
Thanks.
Segueing back onto what I sort of take from what you've written, but also from what we've discussed so far, basically that the fundamental relationship to abolish in society is the relationship between a mother and a child.
It doesn't get much more fundamental than that.
And as we saw with the video, as we began with, this idea of full surrogacy now, and you talk about the kind of almost the ick that people experience with in relation to pregnancy, and it's sort of being viewed as this sort of unhygienic thing. And so I guess the thing for me that is so fascinating about your unpacking of the concept of the devouring mother is that because that relationship between a mother and child is such a fundamental relationship, and you talk about the way in which it's viewed with suspicion, almost as if it's inherently bigoted, because it is by nature exclusionary, because it's my child. Women, when you ask them, don't want to take care of someone else's child, they want to take care of their child, and it's natural. And the ultimate sort of abolition is the abolition of nature itself.
Yeah.
And so it's attacking the kind of organic basis of society and a proper organic understanding, I think, that is true. It is an honest account of what society is. And so it seems to me that the implication of your idea of this sort of cyborg theocracy, the devouring mother that liquefies everything, is that the sort of that idea of the mother-child relationship being exclusionary, you can sort of map that onto society at large.
Well, Sophie Lewis actually does this. Sophie Lewis is kind of my intellectual kryptonite, or I'm hers, I don't know. Anyway, we have profound differences. She wrote the books, The Full Surrogacy Now, and she explicitly draws the connection between the particularistic bond of mother and baby, which she views, well, she uses the term proprietarian. It seems not to occur to her that there are other relationships of authority other than property. But in that sense, she's drunk more deeply with the neoliberal Kool-Aid than I think it's possible to drink. Anyway, she sees the idea that we might have particularistic affection for children that we gestated ourselves as proprietarian, which is to say a kind of oppressive. That means that we're viewing our children as our property and as something that we therefore have control of. And what she conceives of as a proprietarian relationship to our own children, she generalises at the scale of nation states, and she draws a direct connection between that and the borders around countries, and is essentially arguing that if we're going to liquefy the borders between countries in the name of social justice, then by extension we must liquefy that at the micro level as well, which means we need to liquefy the bonds of family, because if the justification for a national border is the idea of a national family, then the only way we can destroy that is if we're doing it at the micro scale as well, because otherwise it will just replicate itself again and again.
So one of your solutions to the problem, the sort of main weapon in the arsenal, you said, is marriage.
Yes.
And that is, you hear it all the time, particularly from conservative traditionalists, that family is the basis of the nation. That's sort of the fundamental, foundational building block of a strong society. So if you were to sort of like map that thesis in reverse and sort of view society as, fundamentally in a familial and kind of organic sense, like how do you view family and marriage as being the sort of first port of call when it comes to responding to the cyborg?
You mean if marriage and family is the microcosm, then what's the macrocosm?
Or how does the microcosm relate to the macrocosm?
That's a really difficult question, because I've also argued recently that I think the nation state is toast. I think it's over, it's done.
Is that because of the cyborg theocracy, or because you think that marriage won't succeed?
I think
mass marriage.
It's for the depressing reason that there's just no elite consensus for it. The people who make the vast majority of those people who are actually in a position to do anything about it don't want there to be national borders really to speak of anymore. That's just where we are. Broadly speaking, the people who do want there to be national borders have no power, and nobody cares about what they think. So that's just where we are. What we do about that is another question. I don't know what's going to happen next. I've kind of swerved in the book trying to think about, what any of this implies at scale, because you could just write the whole book again sort of 4 or 5 times over. So I just kind of, I just confined all of that to one little short chapter at the end about all the other books that I wish I could have written alongside it. The one about ecological collapse, and the one about peak progress, and the one about reactionary Leninism, and just all of those other things. Sorry, I didn't say that out loud. Ask me later.
Are you as bleak about combating the cyborg theocracy? I hope calling your view bleak. I don't know if that's a fair representation, but
I mean, at the end of the day, I have faith in people, and a sort of depressing. I quoted Horace somewhere in the book, that famous aphorism of his where he says, "You can drive nature out with a pitchfork, and still she comes back." I can't quote the Latin, I don't actually speak Latin. But anyway, and I think Horace was actually complaining about this. He hated gardening. And that's what he's basically moaning about, the fact that he has to do the weeding again. It doesn't matter how often you drive nature out with a pitchfork, bastard weeds just come back again. But I've nicked it for a different reason. And what I wanted to argue with it is that it doesn't matter how hard you try to liquefy human nature, it just comes back. And to an extent it will come back reordered to the market, but it will come back. I don't think we're going to get ecto-womb factories, because I think you could probably create something humanoid with them, but they wouldn't be people. Because they wouldn't be people, because they'd be missing something fundamental. It might take 10 years, 20 years for that to become apparent, and then people would reel in horror at what they'd done, and they wouldn't do it anymore.
Do you think, Nina, we're already seeing a kind of allergic reaction to that, as you were describing, younger people sort of sick of the sort of the infinite space of the online existence?
I think so. I mean, I think, the fact is we are still the same kind of creature, which is a natural being that comes in 2 sexes. As we always were, right? along with all of the emotions, and people keep going on about AI. Look, maybe AI will kill us. I don't know, but the AI doesn't have a body, right? Like, yes, you can ask the AI to write you a poem about, feeling
shit
sad.
Poem.
But like it's like there is a kind of. I'm thinking of it more probably like a pendulum swing, right? Like I think I don't think we'll necessarily have this kind of like full on like. Organicist, pro-nature kind of revolution will destroy all the machines. But maybe, and I think that, our relationship to our own machinic capacity is very complicated. Like we are the kind of creature that uses tools, and sometimes those tools make us tools, right? This is the kind of constant problem that we have, in that we are deeply Promethean as a species. We spend half our time making things, well, some of us do. We could be contemplating, right? There are 2 options. Either you act or you contemplate, right? And the West particularly has gone down the action route, as Gwenon would say. And Christianity is a very complicated thing. Religion is very complicated as a social technology too, because, we could say quite obviously that Christianity leads to liberalism, right? Like the universalism of Christianity is also that which destroys a nation too, right? Potentially, and you end up with a kind of universalist liberal subject. And at the same time, the tension between like the family and religion is very complicated as well. Like we tend to think of the family being like, sort of Christians being pro-family, like particularly in an image of, I don't know, American sort of right-wing Republican Christianity. But actually, like religious devotion is often very against the family, right? Like if when Jesus says like in Luke, where, follow me, like leave your family, right? So I think the relationship between like traditionalism and religion and family is very, very complicated. There's a very interesting book by Ferdinand Mount, who is Thatcher's speechwriter, which called The Subversive Family. It's a very interesting book. I think it's from the early 80s. And he basically says, actually, look, the nuclear family, we're used to accepting this kind of Marxist argument almost, that the nuclear family is a product of the Industrial Revolution, and that before that people lived in like extended families, and then before that tribes probably, and something like this, right? We sort of have this kind of like vague understanding of family. He says that's bollocks. He says the nuclear family is the oldest institution, and in fact it's basically always been like father, mother and child. Yes, there might be in extended families, but basically the unit's always been this. and that actually it's oppositional to nations and all of the things that nations want to do, like armies, right? Why do states want you to have children? It depends. Sometimes they want you to, sometimes they don't want you to, right? We're in a particularly anti-natalist moment, right? Complicated why that's happening, right? Why aren't people having children? Like the birth rate is globally smashed, right? The only people having children are like religious fanatics, like Orthodox Jews in parts of Israel and the Amish, right? Even in sub-Saharan Africa, the birth rate is like dropping. Is this like a species-wide event? Who knows? But there is nevertheless a kind of culture which is sort of encouraging like a total antinatalism, right? Like, so whether people want to have kids or not is becoming really difficult. Like if you're a millennial, where are you going to live? Like you don't know where to live, how are you going to have a family? We're not really encouraging people to do that. And even to say these things, like at National Conservatism, this conference recently, people were getting smashed for like defending the family and saying like, probably it's better if they stay together. And everyone's like, you Nazi. Well, it's absolutely insane. Like, how hard it is to be like pro-family. So anyway, but I think there's something in that idea of the subversive family, that the family is actually the thing that opposes all of the attempts to kind of take people out of it, whether they be religious. And so I wonder about this kind of, Mary's brilliant on the internet, she's like a kind of cultural theorist of the internet in many ways. And I wonder if like, thinking about memes, like what would be the meme that we would need to like the nature meme, like, or whatever, like how to get people back into their bodies, like the body meme or whatever.
I don't know. I think what's the opposite of the Lego meat Gnosticism?
I think honestly, you just have to not be on the internet. If you're on the internet consuming memes about going back to nature, you've already lost.
Yeah.
But just sort of on a note of qualified optimism, one of the things I thought I'd get absolutely slaughtered for, more generally, would be coming out strongly against the pill. One of the last chapter in the book I wrote, I made the feminist case against the pill. As the central technology.
Rewilding sex.
Rewilding sex, yes. The ecological case against the pill is unanswerable. It's robust. It's catastrophic for wildlife, which is a cognitive dissonance that all of those green feminists just don't want to think about.
That's because of the estrogen in the water.
Yes, the estrogen in the water, which is causing sex reversal in frogs, and it's disastrous. It's horrendous. Alex Jones is not completely wrong. It's really...
Didn't see it taking that turn.
But I quoted Alex Jones in the book. This made Brendan O'Neill very upset. He was really angry with me for quoting Alex Jones, but he's not completely wrong. I'm not going to go into the whole Alex Jones thing anymore, but the feminist case against the pill, it's the central technology for... That gives us the illusion that we can escape the limits and the constraints of our own body. That gives us the illusion that men and women can become functionally interchangeable. That's the core technology, and my argument is that if we're going to reclaim a sense of ourselves as embodied and dimorphic and equal in dignity but different in embodiment, then that starts with the case against the pill. And what's really surprised me is that the blowback I've had on this has been from boomers. Almost, and Brendan O'Neill, who's a spiritual boomer, but the rest of it has almost all been boomers. And actually younger women, the women in their 20s who've read it, they've been like, yeah, this makes sense for the most part. And that massively surprised me. So I don't know, maybe there is a backswing.
Can you explain this idea more of Lego meat Gnosticism and then the Gnostic Madonna?
Oh God,
because
that's going to take so long to explain.
It's crucial to sort of understanding this, this idea that you can almost live like an avatar where all of your bits are infinitely replaced and parts of you can be spliced with fish skin and it seems to be sort of like core to the theological worldview that you see.
I suppose the logic goes roughly thus. If we have these technologies which flatten the central, most salient differences between men and women, which is to say women's reproductive role, so we can use the pill and we can use abortion to undergird women's ability to work in the same way as men, at least if you do a knowledge job. And we can use these technologies to de-risk sex for both sexes, such that women can have sex like the most sociosexual and commitment-phobic of men, and this is good, apparently. Then it follows from that we could use the tech. I mean, why would you stop there? If you can use technology to liberate us from the constraints of our own reproductive role, why would you stop? Why would you not use technology to liberate us from other constraints of our bodies? You know, why would you not apply the same logic of using biomedical interventions in our endocrine systems to, for example, give somebody the appearance of the secondary sexual characteristics of the opposite sex, should they wish them? I mean, why not? You know, the logic, you can trace a direct line from the contraceptive pill and the idea of abortion as freedom to transgender medicine. You know, the Planned Parenthood handily made this into a gift for me the other day. I spent an entire third of a book trying to explain this logic, and Planned Parenthood are just like, yeah, gender affirmative care and abortion and and contraception, it's the same fight. And I'm like, yes, this is what I've been saying. So yeah, I mean, yeah, Planned Parenthood agree with me. We just differ on whether it's a good thing.
One of the people that you interviewed for the book, a guy called Steve, I think it was Steve, is that correct? And he transitioned and felt that there was this. You mentioned a T-shirt that said, "I survived testosterone poisoning." And so, Nina, you've written about men, and there is obviously this sort of like for both sexes, there is this kind of relentless negativity, but particularly with men, and the idea of toxic masculinity. And it seemed in this particular case to have sort of influenced somebody's decision to transition. This sort of feeling of if I go through puberty, I'm going to be poisoned by testosterone, and I'm going to become this evil person just by nature of my birth. What do you think of the sort of the Lego meat Gnosticism in relation to men particularly?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just before I get to that, I mean, I guess the broader context is what Ivan Illich, amongst others, but particularly him, great thinker, great Catholic thinker, talks about with the industrialization, which is the making proximate of men and women, right? And that the idea that there is no longer specific domains, what he calls vernacular gender. He uses gender in a weird way, but let's say vernacular sex. So the idea that there are different domains for men and women, and this would involve different tool use. And he says all of that's completely smashed with modernity and the Industrial Revolution. So anyone could do any job. What this actually means in reality, you know, and of course there are some jobs that are still, you know, male and female, but basically the ideal worker becomes an interchangeable, like neither male nor female, right? Let's say like human.
A fungible token.
Yeah. So, but what that means in terms of the relationship between the sexes is that they become too proximate. So I think we're basically living in the era of the brother and the sister. We're more like siblings. There is no longer any kind of relation of complementarity or like cosmic sexual difference. And this has had all kinds of like psychic messed up things, right? So, you know, the most obvious, I guess, the most symptomatic would be the idea that the fantasy that you can change sex, and that you know what it's like to be the opposite sex, and that you feel yourself to be the opposite sex. You know, obviously these things are impossible, but it sort of like comes about precisely because we are sort of like interchangeable. You know, and that there is this proximity that's kind of being imposed by a kind of economy and a politics and a culture, and you know, what this has meant, I think, is that when we engage in forms of outgrouping and scapegoating, which human beings constantly do, in order to, I don't know, whatever, feel slightly better about ourselves or something, you know, like the idea of the group of men, like that men can become the kind of group that is to blame, you know, for the time being. And of course, you're going to get men trying to escape manhood, because if manhood is ontologically toxic, right, like there's no possibility of being a good man, why the hell would you want to be a man? At the same time, you've got a total discouragement of all of the things that actually make men masculine, so anything to do with physical health or whatever. And of course, that's why those things are situated as right wing. You know, you're basically like a fascist if you go to the gym. I mean, you know, like, but they're deliberately positioned in those ways, right? Because the economy doesn't necessarily want those kind of, or need those kind of men particularly. You know, and I'm not saying it's like some grand conspiracy to make everyone into like a total cuck, but it is. But you know, so you have this kind of pushback. But really, what it is, it's also a kind of moral question, right? If the liberal subject can follow his or her desire, and that desire is the most important thing in the world, right? Like what you want to do, like a toddler, becomes who you are, right? And this is a very pornographic culture, a very consumerist culture, you know, then that will go to identity. Why can't you just change your identity? Because you spend too much time watching anime and you relate to one of the characters and you're like, oh, maybe I'll be like this character on the, you know, cartoon or something. I mean, very weird. You had it prefigured in actually like Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Like the breast enlargement thing came about partly because Jessica Rabbit, who's like a cartoon rabbit, became like this kind of fetish object. It's really strange.
Sexy rabbit.
Sexy rabbit. You know, who doesn't want to be a sexy rabbit? I mean, normal people. But anyway, but you know, so the problem is like there's no possibility of being a good man or a good woman because the desire is radically positioned as the central thing about who we are. Our entire identity is supposed to be tied to what we want. But that's a terrible thing to tie your desire to. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's the worst thing in the world.
When you map that onto the idea that which begins with the transhumanist turn in the 1960s, that everything about our physiology is not that there are no normal organismic processes or tendencies or formations or shapes. All we have is an endless menu of expressive options that we can select from as we see fit. And when you map that onto what Nina's describing about, you know, the toxification of masculinity, you know, the sort of the mass scapegoating of male. You know, I mean, it's no wonder. It's no wonder that you get not particularly attractive or popular guys, quote unquote, tranny-maxing, which is a thing. Tranny-maxing is a thing. These are guys who intentionally set out to become transgender because they just think they have a better chance of getting laid. This is real. People like these are guys, and lots of them report that it's genuinely changed their lives for the better. I mean, it's pretty dark, but I mean that's the logical endpoint of treating our physiology as a menu of expressive options. But then you rewind that back to puberty, and you hear people talking not just about. You hear people talking about children who feel like they want to, who identify as the opposite sex, experiencing the wrong puberty, and you're like, hang on a minute, there's no such thing as the wrong puberty. Your body just has its puberty. Every body has a sex.
How much do you think this has to do with the internet? So like the fact that gender dysmorphia used to be more men, now it's more women, and this idea that you talk about in the book of being a sort of like being of sort of pure thought. Like how much does, like, is gender dysphoria being caused by the internet, by the internet's existence?
I think it's acted. I mean, there were people who experienced gender dysphoria before we got the internet, but it's been a massive accelerant because it just normalises the idea that who we are as a person is separable from our physical embodiment. I mean, I speak from experience here. I mean, I hated puberty. I hated being embodied. I absolutely detested having to exist in my physical self. And when I discovered the internet about the age of 19, because that's how old I am, I was like, this is amazing. I don't have, you know, I can just be me. And it's like, you know, but I mean, and then you think about that and you think, well, what's the me that is independent from this? There isn't. It's not really, you know, you still have to eat and you still have to shit. And that me, which is independent from all of that, is kind of, it's an illusion. But it's an illusion that a lot of kids now spend sort of 12 to 16 hours a day in. And is it any wonder that they imagine that they can reskin their meat avatar as easily as they can one on the internet? I mean, it would seem like a matter of, it would seem self-evident and like a matter of basic justice that you should be allowed to do that, and that your disembodied me should come first. So yeah, absolutely, I think it's an accelerant. I don't think it's the only factor, but I think it really has poured petrol on a raging bin fire.
How big a role do you think it plays, Nina?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the question of like the imagistic culture, like we live in a like profoundly imagistically oversaturated culture, and like the way the West has dealt with that is to pretend that images don't really matter, like they're interchangeable, but they're not. They like affect us very, very, very deeply, and what you watch actually like has a huge effect on who you think you are and what you desire and so on, right? So pornography would be the most obvious example. And I think what you see, like one of the reasons why a lot of young women are feeling profoundly discomforted in their own body, as they often do, and in fact we all, you know, again, if we had a ritual culture that understood that kind of recognised the suffering of puberty itself, for example, like this would be a different story. But because it's individualised, what you have is a lot of young women who are trying to escape the image, right? Because the pornographic image is so dominant. It's like the idea, it's totally understandable. You think, okay, I can escape being looked at by basically disappearing into the background and like by being non-binary, or, you know, for some reason, like, we were allowed to be tomboys, right? I was a tomboy, it was great. I wore, like, quote unquote men's clothes until I was 23, because I was like, I want to be a mind, you know, I just want to hang around with my male friends, I don't want to be an object, right? Whatever, I mean, it's sort of, you know, that itself is a strange thought, but now it's like, okay, I'm non-binary, I'm trans, you know, but it's a way of disappearing, right? And it's not really it's about being a man, it's about not being a woman, because to be a woman is to be a pornographized image, right? And this is why you also see from the male side so many men who are obsessed with pornography, like being autogynephilic, like confusing their object of desire, which is to say the woman, and thinking, I'm the woman, right? Like becoming the woman, becoming the object of her own desire, because we've let desire just go like insane, you know, and people are just sort of indulging their desire, and thinking that their desire makes them who they are, you know, when in fact it's the how to put it, the disciplining of desire that makes us who we are. And that's what true freedom is, right? We think that freedom is the indulging of desire, because that's a liberal model of freedom. But freedom is actually the freedom from your own desires. It's the freedom from being dominated by, you know, things that actually ruin you, right? Anyway, so, yeah, images.
So before we open the floor to questions, final thoughts on what to do about it. So what's the solution? Do you have an idea of what the hell you do to combat the cyborg theocracy?
Well, I've suggested three micro-scale interventions, ways of pushing back, but really just at a personal level. I made the post-romantic case for marriage, which is to say marriages which are based on commitment and loyalty for the purpose of raising kids, and rather than as a vehicle for self-actualization, which is, I think, pretty much where we've got to with marriage now. And that's based on the premise I have, which is that for most people, the end of economic abundance is already here and has been for some time. And you know, there might be a small subset who are going to go on getting richer, but for the vast majority, you know, scarcity is real and it's going to get worse. And under those circumstances, if you want to be a mum, you'd be nuts not to be looking for a partner who's going to show up for you. You know, this just seems obviously the feminist message to give to 20-something women. So that's thing number one, the post-romantic marriage. And I don't think creating a home like that is going to look anything like the 1950s, where, you know, sort of Kinderküche or anything like that. I mean, I think I've made the joke before that we should be going back to the 1450s rather than the 1950s, and trying to re-engineer the productive household, where, you know, that the household as the centre of the household as an economy,
which could be facilitated by the internet.
Which could absolutely. I mean, I'm not a total tech hater. You know, I think technologies are, you know, they come with directions and they come with undercounted costs, but then it's not as though I just want to unplug the internet. Well, maybe I do a little bit, but but we're not going to unplug the internet, right? You know, we are where we are, so we have to make the best of it. And one of the upsides of it, of the internet, is remote work, which means that you actually can have a productive household now. I mean, that's what my life looks like. You know, and the numbers are in as well. Over the course of COVID, those families who are able to work remotely had a mini baby boom. You know, and I think there are glimmers of hope in anecdotes like that. So, you know, back to the 1450s, but with internet. So it's not going to work for everybody, but it might. You know, there's a glimmer of hope there. Feminist case against the pill. Stop using it. Don't tell your friends not to use it. I've predicted before, and I stand by this. I think banning the pill will be within the Overton window in the next 10 years, because it's so bad for the environment. And it's just so bad for people. And it's poisoning our sexual ecology, just like it's poisoning the water table. You know, and that's not to say that I think women shouldn't exercise any agency over their fertility, but I just think the pill is a terrible way to do it. Hormonal birth control should not be. It just shouldn't be. So that. But there's a great deal else that follows about embodiment and, you know, working with your fertility, and if you're a woman, exercising judgment about who you have sex with, that follows from leaving the paradigm that says we're sterile by default, which is really what I'm talking about. I think is abandoning the paradigm that says, you know, women are sterile by default, and fertility is a switch we flick on when we've given it lots of serious thought. No, it should be the other way around. And I think if we're conducting ourselves and our relationships from that place, and we're doing so with a great deal more impulse control and a measure of dignity, there's an immensely powerful way to be a woman from that position. And number three, I think we need to allow men more space. I wrote a whole chapter called "Let Men Be." I think the loss of male sociality has been a very undercounted cost of making everything co-ed, which is what Nina has been talking about. And there have been lots of upsides, particularly for ambitious elite women, of making everything co-ed, and access to opportunities. I mean, God, I wouldn't be here necessarily if it wasn't for some of that stuff. But it's come at the cost of making spaces, it's come at the cost of single-sex spaces for men who are never gatekeeping resources, and they weren't gatekeeping power, and they weren't gatekeeping anything really. They were just meeting down the pub amongst themselves as men to talk. And I think if we're not willing to acknowledge that the loss of that could have come at the cost of something that mattered a great deal for men, then we're not going to get anywhere, and certainly we're never going to be able to find any kind of solidarity with the great many men who are now really quite resentful. And this is a subject which I broach carefully, but there are a lot of men out there who are incredibly angry and they're incredibly resentful, and a lot of that comes out as a very vicious misogyny, particularly on the internet, which can be really unpleasant to read if you are female. But when I read these guys who are like, we're not going to help you with trans women in women's prisons and rape shelters because you wanted everything to be co-ed and now it is. You made your bed, ladies, so now you can lie in it. And I think, well, if we're ever going to be able to respond to that, other than just by shouting and saying, you're a misogynist and come on, you've got to help us, then I think, probably a starting point is to listen and say, well, if maybe, you're being a dick, but there's probably a wound in here as well, and maybe we need to weigh that. And I think, an upside of granting, of just stepping back a bit, where single-sex spaces are concerned, for both sexes. I think we need to be more intentionally, whimsically sexist about how we socialise. As a footnote, the only successful long-standing group chats on the internet I've ever been in are always single-sex, absolutely without fail. I know I've been in short-lived co-ed group chats, but the long-term ones are always single-sex. Absolutely without fail. And I think the fact that happens even in this disembodied space should tell us something.
What do you think, Nina? What are your thoughts on what on earth we can do and whether you can actually drive nature out with a pitchfork or whether it will just fail?
No, I mean, I think nature will reassert itself. Well, we are part of nature as well, let's be clear. We're like fragments. And I agree with most of what Mary's saying. I think probably all of it. I mean, I've got my diaries from when I was a teenager, and I was reading them recently from when I was 13. I went to a normal comprehensive school, a mixed sex school, and oh my God, it's not a good idea to have lots of teenage boys and teenage girls together. My diary is just filled with stuff about crushes and sexual desire and so on, and it's just what a waste of fucking time, I could have been learning Latin, and I don't think I was not at my shit school, but no, it wasn't that bad. But what I'm saying is that why are we putting boys and girls together, all the time? I think it's not actually a very good idea, and it's it's the rich who are kind of privileged to make that decision, right? So I think there are certain things that the rich know are good, and they sort of keep them for themselves. So I think, it would be, better to give people the option to, I think more people homeschooling because they saw how awful school was during lockdown. So a lot of people are like, well, I'm going to teach my child or in a small group, which makes a lot of sense. So I think that also builds character and all of those things like real relations, all the social bonds which are being destroyed by the market. I think we need more humour and actually courage, like Kathleen Stock yesterday, with this unbelievably dignified nobility and her very moderate views. She's not even a really hardcore TERF or anything. She's just can we have a conversation and, maybe, she's very much more articulate than that, but you know what I mean? She's very, very, very gentle really in what she's saying. She's just saying we need to talk about categories, we need to talk about law. And there's something in that kind of style. It's almost like a manner of doing things, which is to be firm and to say no. And I think like to teach young girls to say no is really difficult. It's hard to say no as a woman anyway, even if you're an asshole, you know, and it takes a long time to become this really unpleasant person, you know, but what an achievement. But, you know, like I think things like these boundaries, like we need to say, look, you know, you have this body, it's organic, it's sacred, it has these functions, it's really cool, it can do these things, look after it. You know, and I don't know whether that means bringing back gods. I'm all in favour of that, whether it's Spinoza's God, God as nature, or the Christian, the nice sort of coffee morning Anglican God. Like probably God. You know, most religions definitely celebrate the two sexes. You know, they're very, very fundamental as kind of like anchors of reality. So I think like defending reality with a sort of moderate humour, probably the English response, but I think that's probably like what we have to do.
Brilliant. Well, let's take questions. So it's a very bright light. Does Jordan have the microphone there? So if we could take the question, the end that I actually can't see whose hand that is because the light's so bright. And then we'll go to Jan also, and we'll take a question from Paul, and we'll do batches of 3.
Mary, is this working? Yeah. Mary, you touched on the dark side of being a mum. You've thought about and explored these issues very deeply, and you've written the book, and you've become something of a lightning rod for discussions around these topics. And I'm just wondering how that's affected your approach to being a mother and being a parent.
We'll take 3 at a time so you can sort of give general comments on anyone that you want. So Jan, and then we'll go back to Paul.
Thanks, Emma. It's very, very interesting, and I do think it's really important that we develop arguments in favour of the family, in favour of boundaries, pro-baby. All of these kinds of arguments need to be remade. However, I am really, really worried that you're giving away our choices at the very point where we've gained them. And I think it's only possible to argue that you can give away choices from the luxurious position of having them. And I worry that in this very kind of subjective presentation to younger women of what the truth is of womanhood or motherhood, that there's a kind of leaping over the reality of what it was like for women when they did not have choices. And the pre-pill position, the pre-contraceptive position, the pre-abortion position for women in Britain, if you read the literature on what that was like for women and the demand that was created for contraception and the pill and abortion by the necessity of the absence of choice, I think that would be you'd get far further in making a more developed argument for where we need to go to next.
Paul? Oh, Sylvie has it now, so Sylvie can. Sylvie can, and then Paul.
I was surprised that you don't talk about surrogacy or sperm donors, because you talk about the link between the parents and the children. And for example, you were talking about Kathleen Stock, which is very audacious, who is very audacious about biology and the reality, and she has a child with a woman. So I'm interested by your point of view about that. Or Dave Rubin, who's very linked to biology and reality, and who has children with a man.
Yeah. Paul can be first in the next round, so we'll do 3 at a time. Sorry, Paul. So pick away whichever questions you want to come to.
I'll take those in order. On whether or not thinking about this stuff has changed me as a mum, it probably has, but I'm loath to say too much about that, because how I care, I just try and keep my daughter, except in as much as I talk about how I think about her, but I try not to talk about parenting her in public, because that's also about her, and it's private. So I think I have a boundary there. Yes, it probably has. I mean, you know, my life has changed a great deal over the time I've been thinking about that. So, inevitably, you know, how I've cared for her has changed. She's growing up as well, but yeah, I think that's something, you know. But ask me about it later, not in front of an audience. On the question of contraception and abortion, yeah, I've read Margaret Sanger's collected letters. This is one of those areas where I just don't, you know, it's about as grave as it gets, and I don't think there are ever easy solutions. There are always trade-offs. And I've not taken an unequivocal position against abortion in the book. And in as much as I've taken a position against the pill, it's been explicitly in the sense, you know, I've treated this as something, you know, I'm not advocating for banning the pill as a policy position. I'm advocating for women eschewing the pill as a personal decision. That's where I am with it at the moment. But this is one of those areas where there are always trade-offs, and I've set out to unpack some of those trade-offs. And yes, I agree with what you're saying. Yes, absolutely. There were women didn't have choices before. We have them now, and you know, and I suppose I would say yes. I acknowledge that those choices have come with a huge amount of upside. I would say that upside has landed asymmetrically, and it's principally landed for better off women, and the downside, a great many of the downsides have landed asymmetrically on less well off women. But those trade-offs are there, and sometimes there are no easy answers. So yeah, I hear you. I've set out to unpack some of those some of those ambivalences. On the third, on the question about surrogacy, yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much more that we could talk about. Especially on surrogacy. I didn't actually write a great deal about surrogacy in the book because there's so much that I couldn't. There are so many rabbit holes you can go down. I've written about it. I've written about it more recently. And I suppose the point, you know, just to the movie that we all enjoyed, quote unquote, at the beginning. I mean, when I wrote about that, when it first did the rounds, I made the point that pregnancy doesn't just create a baby. You know, the proposal here is for a machine that would create a baby, but pregnancy doesn't just create a baby; it creates a mother. It creates, and Donald Winnicott very famously said, "There's no such thing as a baby. There's only a baby and someone. There's only because a baby can't survive on its own. A baby survives with the person who cares for the baby, and the person who is most completely primed to do that is the mother who gestated the baby, because the process of pregnancy rewires you to be ready to do that. And of course, other people, you know, that's life isn't perfect, and sometimes babies have to be cared for by somebody other than their mother. You know, adoption happens, or mothers die, or you know, there are all sorts of things that can go wrong and interrupt that. And humans are amazing. You know, we also have an ability to love and care for and become attuned to babies who are not blood who we didn't gestate. This is an amazing power that we have, and it means more babies survive, and that's great. But the person who's most primed to do that is the mother. And if you're proposing a technology which enables, which fundamentally treats that as something which is of no importance, then I would suggest that we're laying in a store of disasters down the line.
But in the video, the baby knows who the parents are.
But yeah, but the machine doesn't create a mother. The machine does not create a mother, and so it creates a deficit of mother. If we had that, hypothetically speaking, it would create babies, all of whom had a deficit of mother love baked into their experience from the word go. And we can only speculate at the effect that would have at scale, but I think it would be significant.
Did you want to come in on any of
Yeah,
those
just briefly. I mean, I think any kind of healthy society would be able to support economically, socially, politically those people who wanted to marry and have a family. And I think, you know, we're in this terrible situation where lots of young people want to do that and may be afraid to do that, but then there's not really a culture that's encouraging them or saying that those things are like possible, or even that they're high status, you know. And I think in places like South Korea, where the birth rate has dropped really low, you have places that are banning children, like restaurants are banning children, and that's kind of a self-perpetuating spiral, right, where things become more and more anti-children, more and more anti-family, and then you end up with a very divided society, right, where you have individuals and then people, and so there's a question of like status, like the status of the family, but I think any good society would also have room for those people who can't or won't or, get married and have children, right? And I don't just mean nunneries and and monasteries, but I think, the internet is in a way, I think of it often like a kind of monastery, like an online monastery. All these men are making illuminated manuscripts and we're making memes and stuff. There's always like this kind of question of like, there are probably always too many men. This is in my book I talk about men going their own way, which is a kind of very strange male separatist movement that tries to basically preemptively give up on the whole dating and marriage game and say, it's not gay, then it's not about gay male sexuality, but it's about heterosexual men saying, I'm not going to play the game. I'm only interested in doing what I want to do. It's sort of kind of individualistic, but it celebrates unmarried, childless men. And they make the claim that something like 40 to 60% of men in history never had children. And they work this out by saying, look at all the men who die young in war, right? We don't do that anymore. Well, there's Ukraine, whatever. But, we don't tend to have wars in the same way, which generally tends to kill a lot of men. So you have a lot of men who are basically not in a position, they become resentful, you also have unbelievable horizons of possible choice, right, which makes it very difficult for like your average man necessarily to compete with at least the fantasy of like the ideal man, right, and if you grew up in a village, you'd marry like the brothers from down the road, right, but now everyone's obsessed with like film stars and stuff, right, everyone's looking up potentially. So, we've got a mismatch. And one of the things I like about Mary's work is that she talks about abolishing big romance. That actually what you're looking for, if you want to settle down and have a family, like you need to pick someone who's like just good and solid and serious. It's not about some dynamic romantic sort of drama. It's about finding someone who's actually like a good man, right? Again, we need to bring back this good man thing. So, I do think on the contraception point, what's going on with lots of young women is that they are using natural birth control, like Sophia's in the audience, she's written about this recently, and this kind of, like actually having this kind of, and in some ways quasi-technological relationship, like using apps and temperature measurements and so on to understand like your own natural fertility, right? So rather than giving over your body and your fertility and your body to Big Pharma and to the pill and to some kind of horrible thing which actually really messes you up, the pill is very bad for you. It ruins your judgment and so on about what kind of man you want to have sex with as well. And, so you taking back control. So I think it's got to be about, I can't believe I use that phrase. But yeah, like re-embodying, especially young women, I think, but getting everyone back into their bodies somehow, And it's,
So we've got time for one last quick round of questions, also because it's strangely turning into a fridge in here.
It's really cold and cold.
And so that everybody can get tucked into all of the wine that's waiting for you downstairs. So Paul had the first question, Laura, and then the gentleman in the middle whose head I can't see because that light is so bright.
Thanks, Emma. I'm curious to hear how each of you, Mary and Nina, define or think how feminism ought to be defined, how you would contrast that from how it is defined in popular culture, and how maybe that's different from how it was defined originally. Because my understanding is that from the sort of first wave in the 19th century, feminism was sort of explicitly anti-patriarchy, and that's perhaps the thing that has tied the different waves together. And that explicitly was also against sort of male headship in the family, and against the Christian model of the wife submitting to the husband, but also importantly the husband loving his wife as Christ loved the church, i.e. being willing to die for her. So do you think that that's an important part of your view of feminism, as being against that view of the family or against the patriarchy in general?
Laura?
Thank you. Okay, so it was such a great talk. I really enjoyed it, and I haven't thought through quite how to ask this question. But going back to the idea of how nature is constantly driven out by a pitchfork but comes back, is the pitchfork also a constant force? Did you look at how the cyborg theocracy might have had much earlier precursors? So you talk about how institutions sever that exclusionary relationship to an extent between mothers and babies. What about things like male circumcision and female genital mutilation, which are procedures that affect the body, which also really undermine the protective instincts of a mother? Random question.
Those are
Not
big
very
questions.
well.
The final question there, the gentleman who had his hand up.
Hey, firstly, thank you for coming to give a talk. And secondly, pretty simple question. There are two books that I think relate kind of heavily to some of the things you said. Firstly, on the transhumanist front, I wondered if you read a book by Martine Rothblatt, who's a trans-identifying male called From Transgender to Transhuman. And if you had read it, what thoughts did you have on it? And secondly, the other concept, particularly around safetyism, are you aware of the concept of the longhouse? And what your thoughts on that?
Prescient.
I mean, in a sense, when I talk about the devouring mother, I'm essentially talking about the phenomenon that others on the internet have called the longhouse. I'm just trying to do it without being one of those guys, because I'm just never going to be one of those guys, and I'm trying to. I mean, there's a lot of overlap in the what I'm trying to describe and that whole memeplex. Yes. What are my thoughts on it? I do. This is apologies. I'm going to get very arcane for a moment, just for this guy over here. I do think it's hilariously ironic that the idea of that the longhouse has absorbed wholesale what is essentially a feminist revisionist historiography of patriarchy.
You may need to explain what the longhouse is
Okay.
for those people like me who are not as online as you, Mary.
I'm sorry for my sins. I've been extremely online for 20 years, and the longhouse as a concept originates with a podcaster and genius media artist called Bronze Age Pervert, who's a name some of you may be familiar with, who wrote a book. Well, it's an exhortation. It's a very strange, unreadable text, but I think one of the most influential political texts of the last 10 years, at least. It's sort of difficult to read. It's a bit like kind of Nietzsche meets William Burroughs with a lot of acid. And in it, he argues for many things that are not very coherent, including the idea that we exist under a sort of stifling hegemony stifling feminized hegemony in which men can no longer be heroic. And I'm not complete. It's not totally clear to me what he thinks we should do about this, apart from, I don't know, go and be pirates or something. But that's the idea that we live. Have I done that reductive justice?
I've actually never read the book.
Have you not? Okay. Anyway, so this is now a meme. It now does the rounds on the internet as a sort of shorthand for a sort of a pervasive sense that exists among some young women, some men more than women, some young men that life has become irredeemably feminized and in a way that they don't like. In a sense, I mean, the longhouse is kind of it occupies very similar territory to the territory which is occupied discursively among young women by the patriarchy. Actually, the longhouse and the patriarchy are kind of like two sides of the same coin, and actually both of them make more sense if you replace them with irreducible sex differences I don't like, that have been politicized in ways which I don't like. You know, both of. You know. Anyway, so those are some thoughts on the longhouse. I think it's ironic. I mean, it's sort of the metaphor of the longhouse comes from what was actually a feminist historiography. It was a feminist who reread a lot of ancient anthropology and argued that society once upon a time was matriarchal and this was good and we all lived in big longhouses and everything was communitarian. And Bronze Age Pervert has taken what was basically a feminist reread of the archaeological evidence and has said this, but it's bad. And I think there's something ironic about the fact about that he's basically absorbed the feminist message wholesale. He just isn't happy about it. So that much for the longhouse. I mean, when I talk about the devouring mother, in a sense I'm talking about ways in which the maternal instinct leaks out even when it's been aggressively denied by great swathes of the culture and becomes something pathological when it's institutionalized and abstracted from concrete interpersonal relationships. I think, you know, at the most sort of general level, that's what I'm talking about, which is not a million miles from what BAP is talking about. I'm just not one of those guys. Forgive me, what were the other... I guess that sort of answers your question as well, Paul, about the patriarchy. I mean, I'm hesitant to give a definition of feminism, not least because one of the questions I get most often is, why do you even bother describing yourself as a feminist? I'm like, well, my slightly flippant answer to that is because if I call myself if you call yourself a reactionary feminist, it's a great signal scrambler. But, you know, do I want to define feminism? No, I'm having too much fun at the moment. But yeah, and I don't believe in the patriarchy in the sense of kind of dark matter. I think it makes most sense in the modern. I mean, we don't live in a patriarchy. I mean, you know, we don't. I think it makes much more sense when, in terms of how it's used rhetorically, if you gloss it as irreducible sex differences I don't like. Forgive me, there was one more question.
Yeah, could I answer on the circumcision thing? Just because I've recently...
yes, circumcision. You do circumcision.
Well, it's a very, very interesting question. I'm just going to try to be really brief. I've just reread the bit in Genesis where the covenant is made between Abraham and God on the matter of...
Just about circumcision.
No. No, sure. Yep, I'm getting there. But so what's interesting about circumcision in the Old Testament is that it's a covenant, right? It's a sign of a relation to something higher, and that the sacrifice, right? So where I'm going is the deep, irreducible impossibility of eradicating sacrifice in humanity, right? Because we sacrifice things all the time. I mean, you could see abortion as a kind of mass sacrifice. Battery farming is a kind of sacrifice. Like we're constantly sacrificial, right? We still engage in sacrificial rituals, except we think we're post-sacrificial, right? Which is the most stupid thing of all, right? Christianity tries to solve the sacrificial crisis by Jesus preemptively sacrificing, so we don't need to sacrifice each other. Anyway, but the problem is we continue to sacrifice, and we don't think what we're doing is sacrifice. So I think that, and this would go for our bodies too, right? If you think about the forms of big pharma sacrifice, of transgenderism, of various forms of body modification, you can also see this as forms of ritual sacrifice or scarification or ritual behaviours, right? So we can't eradicate that dimension of our humanity, which is the desire to sacrifice. Either ourselves or other people. And I think we have to draw it out back into the light and say, well, look, okay, maybe we think that circumcision is violent. Certainly female genital mutilation is something rather different from male circumcision in many, many ways. Very, complicated. But at a deeper level, this is something about us that we want to sacrifice something to a higher purpose. And if we forget that that's what we're doing, we end up doing it anyway, really horribly. So I don't know how we recode sacrifice in a way that doesn't cause more harm, because we're already doing it like on industrial scale. But I think that's what your question's really about. But maybe it isn't for you, but it is for me.
And on that note, thank you so much, Mary and Nina. And thank you everyone for your questions.
Thank you, Emma.
So we have a lot of wine downstairs waiting for you. A lot of wine. This was our first experiment in this format. So we would appreciate it if anybody has any feedback, if you can email Jordan, who you should have his email from the RSVP, but it's jordan@commonsensesociety.org. We'd love to hear what you think of this format, what you think we might do better, because Mary was our sort of inaugural experiment in this format.
Is that a recording?
Yes, we are recording, and it will be online. So thank you everybody so much for coming. Before we head downstairs to go full bacchanalia and drown ourselves in wine, Laura has a few words to say as well.
Oh, very kind, thank you.
Do we have a microphone?
Do you want a mic?
Or you can yell, but...
I'm going to really risk lowering the tone after a very, very intellectual talk. What do male rats fancy? Female rats. Good answer. I thought somebody would say cheese. Okay, so normally... not those two. Normally it would be lady rats, but not always. One experimental study found that male virgin rats can be persuaded to fancy lady rats only in jackets. And another experimental study connected men's penises to a device that would measure the engorgement. And when they were shown pornographic images of women, they became engorged, as you'd expect. Then they were shown pornographic images of women in boots, and they were still sexually aroused. And finally, after enough exposures, they became aroused when they saw pictures just of boots. You see, we've known since the 1960s that sexual paraphilias can be conditioned because sex is very powerful. So I thought tonight might be a little bit more about sex than it actually was. And that was a segue into a little bit of a watch this space that Emma invited me to do tonight. So sex, and in particular pornography, can be a psychological weapon. Sex is a very natural, fun and enjoyable part of life, but it has a very powerful reward system. So these days, by the time the average male is 18, he might have seen about 2,000 erect penises in pornography. You mentioned autogynephilia tonight, and it's no wonder really that sex and our sex lives are going a little bit crazy with the proliferation of internet porn, and why we've got sex addiction, porn addiction, and also, you know, on the other side of the coin, the rise of the no-fap movement. And this is why there's
they're the real anti-capitalists, the no-fap guys.
They're not anti-capitalist so much as anti-masturbators.
But they're rejecting the sexual industrial complex. It's heroic.
It is another way of looking at it, yes. So that's why one chapter in my new book is entitled Don't Be a Slave to Sex. So the book is not just about sex. I just thought that'd be a good way to segue into it. My new book, which is co-authored with a brilliant psychologist called Patrick Fagan, is called Free Your Mind, The New World of Manipulation and How to Resist It. For those who know me, I wrote a book called A State of Fear in 2021 about how the UK government weaponised fear during the COVID-19
It's a very good book.
Thank you, Nina.
It is. It's very good.
Thanks. And Patrick is an ex-Cambridge Analytica psychologist. I like to think of him as the Kylo Ren to my Rey. And he's come over from the dark side. And we've written a book about how you free your mind in this new world of manipulation. You see, there are thousands of books, literally thousands, about how you advertise, influence, manipulate, and brainwash people. But astonishingly, and it seems such a simple idea, there isn't yet a book until the 20th of July this year that teaches you how to resist all of those efforts of manipulation. And I think that a salon like this should be interested in it because there have been a lot of provocative ideas in the room this night. It's been manna, it's been so interesting. And we all like to think of ourselves as individual and free thinking. But the fact is that every day there are thousands of efforts to influence you from the moment you wake up when your phone dings and whirs, all through the day, from advertisers, supermarkets, charities competing for your money, Brand A trying to nudge their product above Brand B, governments, propaganda, the pickup artist, even your friends and family, or the humble waiter that asks if you want still or sparkling. So, with any luck, I might be able to do an event with Emma and the Common Sense Society this summer and teach you how to free your mind and long live provocative thoughts and free thinking. Thank you.
Let's drink.